Hey guys, welcome back to All Things Korean. Today's video is all about counting in Korean. And no, this video is not about teaching you the actual numbers. I made this video with the assumption that most of you have already learned that there are two counting systems in Korean. You've got the native Korean system, which is 하나, 둘, 셋, 넷, and then you've got the Sino-Korean system, 1, 2, 3, 4. I think this is pretty much covered in beginner's Korean. If you haven't learned numbers yet, I suggest that you study that a little bit before heading on to this video. Or you know what? Just for reference, you can watch this video first and then go head on to studying numbers. I should do another video on numbers too, actually. Anyway, so when you first learn numbers in Korean, it might have been mind-boggling to know that there are two systems that you need to know. One is already complicated enough when you're learning a completely different language, but now you need to distinguish between the two, and you need to know when to use which counting system for which situation. And this video is going to try to help you in that department. I've prepared 8 rules that can guide you in deciding which counting system to use. These are just very general rules. It's not like to be strictly adhered to, so just use this video for reference, but you don't need to try to stick to it rigidly. With that being said, let's just get started. So the first rule is like the general rule. When you're counting things directly, when you're counting people, when you're counting animals, when you're counting objects, whatever, when you're counting generally, you use the native Korean counting system. 하나, 둘, 셋, 넷. For example, 오늘 3명이 왔어요. 3 people came. Or when you're counting things like books, 책 2권, etc., etc. But when the numbers get higher, generally above 20, then it's acceptable to use Arabic numerals and read it in Sino-Korean instead. For example, 교실에 학생이 35명 있어요 is acceptable, as well as 35명. So when the numbers get higher, both Sino-Korean and native Korean are acceptable. And when it goes over 100, I would say it's usually Sino-Korean instead of native Korean. Rule number 2 has to do with time. Not the actual time when you're counting the number of hours or minutes or seconds. For minutes and for seconds, you need to use Sino-Korean. 우리 30분 후에 만나요. Let's meet after 30 minutes. It's not 30분, it's 30분. Sino-Korean. For seconds, you also use Sino-Korean. 10초, 15초, 30초, etc. For hours, you count in native Korean. 저는 어제 7시간을 잤어요. I slept for 7 hours. However, when the hours get longer, it's also sometimes acceptable to use Sino-Korean. 30시간 동안 운전을 했어요. I drove for 30 hours. That's a really exaggerated sentence, but it's just an example. So it's okay to say 30시간. However, when it's not in units of 10, I think it's more natural to just go with the native Korean again. 32시간 sounds more natural than 32시간. Rule number 4 is concerning age. Now, there are 2 ways to count age. Number 1 is using the counter word 살. So for this native Korean counter word, you would use native Korean numbers. For example, 저는 19살이에요. I'm not actually 19, by the way. This is just an example. So when you're talking casually, you say 살. When you're talking in a more formal context, again, we switch to Sino-Korean and we generally use Arabic numerals. So you might see something like this at a restaurant. 19세 미만 청소년에게 술을 판매하지 않습니다. So 19살 would instead become 19세. So just to recap, 살 is the native Korean and you use native Korean numbers. 세 is the Sino-Korean counter for age and you use Sino-Korean numbers. Rule number 5 is for telling the date. When you're talking about the date, usually everyone uses Arabic numerals and counts in Sino-Korean. 오늘은 2020년 9월 26일이에요. So 2029 26, when you're talking about the day, it's always going to be Sino-Korean numbers. There is a native Korean way of talking about the date, but it's rarely used these days, and I don't think it's necessary to learn that right now, so I won't include it in this video. Number 5 is when we're counting days and months and years. So not talking about the actual date, like September 26th. This is about, how many days, how many months, and how many years. Now, generally, when we are counting months and days and years, I think Sino-Korean is more commonly used. 3일 후에 만나요. 4개월 뒤에 만나요. 2년 동안 준비했어요. However, there are equivalents to month and day and year. And for day, it's 날. For month, it's 달. And for year, it's 해. But this native Korean, I feel like it's used for very, very, very small quantities. So like 두 달, 한 달, 두 달, 석 달, 넉 달. Like even that word becomes a little different. So maybe it's good to know to understand it, but you don't necessarily need to use the native Korean system, in my opinion. But just know that there are Korean equivalents. Number 6, this rule is for 3 specific counterwords, and that is 번, 층, and 동. And the rule about this is quite tricky because for these 3 counterwords, both native Korean and Sino-Korean numbers can be used, but the meaning changes when you do. So let's look at 번 first. 번 is the word that you use when you're counting the number of times you did something, or it can just mean like number. And what do I mean by that? Let's look at the differences between the counting system first. When you say 두 번, it means 2 times. When you say 2번, it means number 2. Okay, so that's the difference. For example, if I say 저는 시험을 2번 봤어요, it means I took the test twice. But if I say 저는 2번 시험을 봤어요, it means I took test number 2. So there's a test number 1, number 2, number 3. But of those, I took test number 2. Do you get the difference? And for 층, 층 is the word to mean like floors in a building or stories. If I use native Korean, I'm counting the total number of floors. So if I say 이 건물은 6층이 있어요, it means this building has 6 floors. But if you hear something like 저는 6층에 살아요, 6층, the Sino-Korean number plus 층 means 6th. I live on the 6th floor. So it's floor number 6 out of everything. I hope you're sensing a pattern here. The same goes for 동. 동 is a word that you use to count buildings, especially like within an apartment complex or something. So you can say 이 아파트는 세 동이 있어요. So there are 3 blocks or apartment buildings within this complex. But if you say 저는 3동에 살아요, the Sino-Korean number, it means I live in building number 3. Usually buildings already have their own labels and stuff, so it will be something like 102동 or A동 or something like that. But you get what I mean. So just to recap for 번, 층, and 동, if you use native Korean numbers, you're just counting how many there are or how many times something is in general. And when you use Sino-Korean, it's pinpointing which number it is out of the whole. Number 7, when you're counting in units that are loan words, then you only use Sino-Korean. Loan word units include things like centimeter, meter, liter, kilometer. We use the metric system in Korea. But when we use words like these, it's always Sino-Korean. So 10m, 40km, 150cm, etc. And lastly, for math equations, we always use Sino-Korean numbers. So for example, 3 곱하기 7은 21이에요. I think, math equations aren't really common in everyday conversation, but it's something that's good to know. So these were the 8 rules of counting in Korean. I hope you get some idea of which counting system to use in which situation. I know this can be a lot to take in, so take notes and keep these rules for later on reference. I hope you found this video helpful and enjoyable. If you did, then please give this video a big thumbs up and subscribe to All Things Korean for more Korean language related videos. Then I will see you in the next one. 다음 영상에서 만나요.